Hello, and welcome to this third episode in my series on the Saw films. As the third episode, this video is obviously tackling Saw 3, and just as with the last two entries, the artwork for the thumbnail of this video is done by Headland. I encourage everybody watching this, Saw fans in particular, to check out Luke's Redbubble link. You can find that in the description below, and there you can find plenty of Luke's Saw-inspired posters, and you can even purchase prints of them, which is a really cool way to support an artist and a fellow Saw fan. And yet again, Luke, thank you for letting me use your art for these videos. So hopefully if you're watching this, you've seen my last two videos, and if that's the case, then you've probably got the hang of this by now. This video will be broken down into 5 sections, all of which are time-coded in the description below, giving you the option to skip to any particular section or jump around as you wish. But the first 3 sections will only have required those watching to have seen the first 3 Saw films, whereas the last 2 sections will be more about where this film fits in the overarching story of the whole series. So you really shouldn't watch those last 2 sections until you've seen the first 6 films. But okay, let's get into Saw 3. So after Saw 2 was mostly unrelated to Saw 1, I was pleasantly surprised to discover this film opening immediately after the last one ended. That's just the first of many ways that this film embraced the serialized aspect that grew to define this series. So in my opinion, Saw 3 is definitely the most violent of all of the Saw films. This opening scene probably establishes that pretty well. Now, I'll save most of my thoughts about the gory nature of this movie for the review and analysis section. But I will say here that if you are not a fan of gore and you manage to sit through this film, then you should be good to go for the remaining 3. I have to say that for me personally though, him putting that dirty sweaty sock in his mouth is more disgusting to me than any of the violence in any of these films.
Pressure down to 70. He's going into shock.
Get an OR ready. I've got to crack his chest.
Can we get a bolus 500 wide open? Now.
So as with all of these movies, there are plenty of cool little scenes that you catch on the rewatch. And Lynn's reaction to this little boy being brought into her ER is a great example of that. You can also see the kid's drawing of a pig in her locker. And as we soon find out, Dylan was a fan of pigs, as evidenced by his stuffed pig. So I'm absolutely ashamed that I didn't bring this up in either of the first 2 videos, but the music by Charlie Clouser is such a defining feature of this series. But yeah, this film alone has some truly terrific music.
Who are you? Who are you? What is this? What are you doing?
So that knife should look familiar to you, but if it doesn't, I will talk about it a bit later.
When you complete the tests, I promise you, you will finally come face to face with the man responsible for the loss of your child. That will be your ultimate test. Can you forgive him?
I remember that it took me several years and several viewings of this movie to catch on to the fact that Jigsaw's tapes for Jeff constantly refer to the man that is responsible for the loss of his child as being his final test.
It is also the key that will bring you closer to the man accountable for taking your child. He doesn't have much time, Jeff.
It took me a long time to realize that he's referring to himself, as he's the one responsible for Jeff losing his daughter.
He chose you. Not me.
I really like that line a lot. In the tradition of me using these videos to point out what is potentially obvious, Amanda's line here has a double meaning. The first being that Amanda didn't choose Lynn to help John. John did. The other one being the first big glimpse that we get into Amanda's mindset in this movie, and that is that John chose Lynn to help keep him alive and not Amanda. Like I said, this is really the first big sign we get of Amanda's jealousy. So you probably noticed that walking past John and his wife is Abby. This is another way that Saw is kind of like Lost, the show that I normally do videos on this channel. Both series tend to have flashbacks that reveal previous run-ins with other characters. A big theme that the two stories share is the idea that everything and everyone is interconnected. So this is the first major thing that is in this movie specifically to be addressed in later films. Prior to this moment, we had no knowledge of John having a significant other, and it doesn't come back up again in this movie. I probably don't need to say this, but I feel it's worth clarifying that Amanda's jealousy of Lynn isn't a romantic jealousy. She very much views John as a father figure, and a large part of her arc in this film is her feeling that she will not be able to live up to his expectations of her and his legacy. So these flashback sequences where we get to see them setting up previous games from other films, we get these in most of the future installments as well. And they've always been among my favorite scenes or sequences in the Saw films. I don't know if I'm alone in that or not, and I can't even really properly communicate why it is I love them so much, but I do. Here, where Jeff finds the part of the photo that has his daughter Corbett in it, is the one time where he actually stops and thinks, oh yeah, what happened to my daughter? You can quite clearly see that thought cross his mind, but it doesn't last long.
You've got to help him, Jeff! Just standing there, you're an accomplice to murder. It was your family. Your wife, your daughter.
The judge's behavior in this scene always gets me. He's going on and on about how Jeff needs to save this man, and if he doesn't, then he's an accomplice to murder just by standing there. And yet he is equally capable of retrieving that key and saving the man. But he's clearly not willing to take the bullet either. So yeah, there's a lot of hypocrisy coming from the judge in this scene.
We're fine, Amanda. We don't need you. I said we're fine.
So here we have John intentionally trying to make Amanda jealous. This is all part of him testing her. He needs to know that she can overcome her emotions and not give in to murdering this person.
Maybe my life isn't the one you were saving after all. Tell me about your daughter. I understand she's quite a little athlete.
Back to back here, we have two great examples of things that are in this film, but are not at all intended to be resolved in this movie. We're meant to wonder, what did that letter say, and why did it cause Amanda to have the reaction that she had? And when we see John pouring wax on a tape, we're obviously supposed to wonder what that's about. Neither of those answers come in this film, and one of them you even have to wait a few films before you actually get the answer.
You're not jigsaw, You hear me? You're nothing! You're not jigsaw, bitch. You're nothing!
So here's a good place to actually get into what exactly is going on with Amanda in this movie. When we see her helping John set up the bathroom game, which was the first time that she was involved in abducting someone and placing them in this gruesome scenario against their will, we can clearly see that she is not really cut out for this. She's very emotional when she's bringing Adam into the room and chaining his leg up and putting him in the tub. And the guilt that she feels after Adam is stuck in there starving to death, and she knows that she's the one that put him in that situation. It obviously drives her to go back and mercy kill him. And because she apparently doesn't have the stomach for this stuff, you can see that she has this insecurity about not being able to be what this man who she regards as her savior wants her to be. And that insecurity is the nerve that Eric hits with his comment that he's yelling as Amanda's walking away. And so yeah, she starts coming back, and then it cuts to black before we see what happens, but Amanda is telling the story and saying that she murdered him. And the knife that we've seen her with in the present day storyline, the one that she uses to cut her thigh with, that's the same knife that Xavier found in the basement of the house in Saw 2, and then had with him when he was chasing Amanda and Daniel down into the bathroom. And then Eric found and took off of him. And it's the knife that we see Eric threaten Amanda with after he's beating her in the tunnels. So the fact that Amanda ends up with this knife after we see that she turned around and went back definitely seems to imply that she probably killed Eric. But getting back on topic as far as what's going on with Amanda, what happens between her confrontation with Eric and the beginning of this film, when it appears that she has been setting up games with Troy and Detective Carey in which they can't escape. So basically, she's setting up these traps to murder them. That's the part that's less clear, and I think is intentionally unclear. We're meant to be wondering why Amanda, whose whole issue here is that she doesn't have the stomach to put people in these situations where they often die. Why would her reaction to that then be to just flat out murder them? And not even in a way that spares them the pain of the traps. They still go through that suffering only to then die, regardless of whether or not they did what they were supposed to do. So while a lot of Amanda's behavior can be understood with just the context of this film, there are still some unanswered questions that are left open for the future installments to kind of address.
I'm a murderer. He took my life from me. So I just returned a fucking favor.
No, Amanda, that's what you thought. But I know different. You left him for dead, didn't you? But I cleaned up your mistakes. And I forgave you for them.
So another question posed by this movie that you have to wait for the answer to is, what does John mean here? Honestly, there is so much that John says in this last act that I remember watching Saw 3 and being like, what the hell is he talking about? But then a year later, watching Saw 4, suddenly everything he says here is now full of meaning. Another thing I haven't really pointed out in my last two videos is this recurring idea of one gun with one bullet. In the first film, obviously Lawrence is given one bullet. He then loads that into the empty gun that Jigsaw has in the center of the bathroom and uses it to shoot Adam. Then the second film had the gun through the peephole, which just had the one bullet that shoots Gus and kills him. And now in this one, you obviously have the bullet that Jeff is given at near the start of his game, which then he gets the other pieces and assembles the gun, and he uses that one bullet to kill Amanda. And this is definitely not the last Saw film to feature this one bullet element.
This was your test. Your game. What do I want? I want to play a game. You are being tested. Your will is being tested. Your will to keep someone alive. Can you do that? Can you follow the rules and grant someone the gift of life? I was testing you.
So now let's talk about the twists. I'd say this one has three major ones, none of which I would say are nearly as impressive as some of the twists in the last two films. That said, I think the one that John was talking to Amanda and not Lynn when he's setting up the game, I think that one is pretty clever. I remember at this point having seen the first two films and being aware of the fact that this movie was almost certainly going to have some sort of twist. I was very much on the lookout for, okay, what's it going to be? Like, what's the thing that's going to shock me? And even with me being vigilant like that, this one got right past me. Now, I didn't find either of the other two particularly shocking. I even remember at various points near the end of the movie thinking a couple times, are Jeff and Lynn husband and wife? Now, in my head, I wasn't able to get past the fact that we'd seen Lynn with another man at the beginning and he was asking about a divorce. I simply wasn't making the connection that he meant he wanted her to get a divorce from her actual husband. So yeah, for that reason, I still wasn't certain that that was the case until they revealed it. Yeah, then the last twist is that John has Jeff and Lynn's daughter. That was the one that I had already kind of assumed based on the fact that she was in the house when Jeff was taken. And honestly, the only reason that this is surprising to Jeff is because he's a horrible father. Saw 3 is the first film in which the director's cut is significantly different from the theatrical version. The director's cut adds a flashback of Amanda's where she has a dream of Adam haunting her, and that is what precipitates her going to mercy kill him in the middle of the night. There is also a significant sequence that was completely removed from the theatrical version, in which John asks to talk to Amanda alone and Lynn takes that opportunity to try and escape, or at least make a phone call. And after she is unsuccessful at that attempt, she's discovered by Amanda, and there's a fight sequence, which just ultimately results in Lynn realizing that she can't escape. Honestly, I could take or leave the fight sequence. I think the editing of it is kind of choppy. But what I appreciate about the sequence is that John tries to talk with Amanda, and that it leaves us wondering what exactly was said in that conversation. And then the last big change that the director's cut has over the theatrical is the ending sequence. In the theatrical version, they kind of awkwardly combine the sequence of John dying and us seeing flashes of his work from the first 3 films. They awkwardly combine that with the sequence of Jeff's tape playing and, it revealing that the daughter is, captured somewhere and Jeff has to play a game to save her. And then Lynn's death happening in the midst of all that too. The director's cut basically just separates those 2 things. Jeff kills John, and as John's dying, he reveals the tape player, but the tape doesn't magically start playing for no reason. In both versions, you can see that John doesn't have a finger anywhere near the play button. Yet in the theatrical version, you just start hearing it, like it just magically started playing. Anyways, in the director's cut, John's dying and he's holding out the tape player, but it's not playing. And as he's dying, we see the flashes of, his work over the past 3 films. And then once he dies, he drops the tape player and the heart rate monitor flatlines and Lynn goes boom. And then, as Jeff is kind of recovering from the shock of that, he scoops up the tape player and he goes and he sits by Lynn and he starts playing the tape. And then you get that as its own kind of reveal sequence. It's a significant improvement, in my opinion. Okay, so let's get into the topic of the gore and violence in this film. This aspect of the series has never been part of the appeal for me. That said, I'm not the type of person that believes that gore or violence makes a movie inherently bad. For me, it all comes down to whether or not it serves the story. Are we being shown this violence, this gore, because the storytellers want us to feel a certain way? Or are we being shown it as part of some quota that has to be met based on the idea that the people that pay money to see these movies expect and want a certain amount of this gore? And strangely enough, I think this film, which I've already said is probably the most gory and violent, is actually one of the best examples of both scenarios. In the opening 20 minutes of the movie, you get 2 different trap scenarios, and then the opening scene of Eric, crushing his foot. And in the case of the 2 traps, at least, I would argue they have no significant effect on the overall plot of this movie. And it does very much feel like, okay, right out of the gate, we've got to give these people what they want. However, once the actual plot of this movie gets going, specifically the traps that Jeff goes through, that whole arc is about Jeff's obsession with revenge. The whole lesson that Jigsaw is trying to teach Jeff, and indeed one of the biggest themes of the movie, is what revenge actually looks like. And that is brutal and disgusting. In each scenario, Jeff is faced with the revenge that he has wanted for so long. And while in each scenario he is very much tempted to give in to it, he always ends up coming to the realization that this thing that he thought he wanted isn't actually what he wants. It doesn't bring him the satisfaction that he thought it would. And on the contrary, it's actually quite disturbing. So for that aspect of the film, I'm absolutely on board with the gore and the violence. It's there specifically because it's meant to repulse us, not to gratify us. Whereas I feel the opposite could be said of the traps in the early part of the movie. Now, something that I hear a lot about this movie is that it was a great conclusion to the original Saw trilogy, and they really should have stopped here, instead of going on and on with the ridiculous sequels. Now, that type of comment has always struck me as very strange, because when I first saw the film, it was definitely my least favorite, primarily because of the incredible amount of things that it leaves unresolved. The first two installments were pretty closed off. Saw 2 definitely ends in a way where you finish watching and you think, okay, they were clearly setting that up, so that they could make more sequels if they wanted to. But just like the first one, there was nothing that it left unresolved. This is so not the case for Saw 3. The truth is, it is absolutely full of things that raise unanswered questions. Who is the woman that was with John in the flashback? What was the nature of their relationship? And did that have any bearing on him eventually becoming the Jigsaw Killer? What was in the envelope to Amanda? What did the letter say? Why did she react that way? Why was John pouring wax onto the tape? What did John mean when he said that he cleaned up Amanda's mistakes? When John tells Jeff that there are threats all around him, what is he referring to? And what is supposed to happen to Jeff now that he failed his final test? All of these things and so much more are reasons why I never understood why so many people say that, oh, Saw 3 would have been a good conclusion. Saw was a good standalone film. Saw 2 could have served as a good standalone sequel. But there is nothing about Saw 3 that makes me feel that it would have been in any way a good conclusion to the story. John and Amanda both die in this film, which can obviously be viewed as a conclusion of sorts. But aside from that, I really don't understand where this idea that Saw 3 was ever supposed to be the last one, I don't understand where it comes from. That does remind me, though, I mentioned last time how one of my criticisms of Saw 2 when I first saw it was the way that it ended with Amanda, set up to take on the mantle of Jigsaw. I felt that was pretty much just sequel bait, and there really wasn't much of merit to that idea. And in my mind, it was setting up the idea that, okay, John will die, but then we can make however many more movies we want with Amanda as, the antagonist. But one of the things I immediately loved about this movie was how they completely subverted that expectation. So that's a good example of something that I immediately liked about the film. However, as I already said, when I first saw this movie, and then for the year between that and Saw 4 being released, I was not actually a big fan of this movie. The first two films had been pretty much standalone stories. So all I could really make of Saw 3 at the time was poor writing and poor filmmaking, where you have all of these loose ends and things that just don't make sense. Not to mention a very awkward structure where the first 20 minutes of the movie have virtually nothing to do with the rest of the movie. All of this contributed to the fact that I just thought it wasn't a good movie. And then, without getting into spoilers, Saw 4 came out. And that's when it became clear to me what this series was going to be. By which I mean a serialized story where you're just getting more of the pieces with each installment, much like a television series or a miniseries. And the reason that I realize that is because of how Saw 4 recontextualizes so much of Saw 3. It retroactively makes Saw 3 a very different movie. And a lot of the things that I didn't like about Saw 3, I suddenly loved. And that's probably a perfect note to transition into the last two sections of this video, which you should not watch unless you have already seen the first 6 films in this series. If you have not seen all 6 of those, please stop watching now. But if you feel like coming back once you have done that, please do so. Okay, so if you still haven't seen at least up to and including Saw 4, I'm begging you to stop watching this video now, as the stuff I'm about to say will forever ruin one of the coolest aspects of that movie. But okay, I'm trusting that everybody that's still watching has seen Saw 4 at least. And now I can express that while kind of planning this video out, I was very much unsure about what to address in this video and what to address in Saw 4, because as anybody that's still watching this should know, Saw 4's big twist is that it was happening concurrently with Saw 3, and thus it retroactively reveals that Saw 3 was really just half of the movie. And so, for example, the pacing that I had criticized about Saw 3, specifically the first 20 minutes having virtually nothing to do with the rest of the movie, that suddenly seems like a deliberate choice once you've seen Saw 4. I remember wondering, okay, why did they bring Rig back, the SWAT commander, and why did they go out of their way to introduce this new detective who seems important if we were never going to see them again for the rest of the movie? And the answer becomes that they are in the rest of the movie. They just split off into their own half of it, that being Saw 4. So yeah, I think I'll save a lot of what I have to say on that topic, you know, the shared timeline of these two movies. I'll save most of that for Saw 4. But that is far from the only way that this film serves as a better piece of the puzzle than it does as its own standalone thing. There's so much in this movie that sets up the serialized narrative, the overarching narrative. And as I've been alluding to for several videos now, that is the thing that makes me such a fan of this series. And in a lot of ways, that all started here. The first big example is the introduction of Detective Hoffman. I remember even before I knew that there was going to be a Saw 4, that I thought that guy was clearly up to something. There's so many hints towards this in that one scene. His comment about all he had to do, his uncomfortable reaction to Carrie figuring out that Jigsaw himself isn't responsible for this trap. And not to mention the fact that Carrie is targeted immediately after this. But most significantly of all is that you can actually see the man pocketing evidence. They put that on screen and let us sit with it for a year before they officially revealed that he was somehow involved in this stuff. More recently, this whole sequence has raised another question in my mind, and that is, when and how did Troy's puzzle piece get cut out? As Carrie observes and Rig, confirms, the door was welded shut. So the puzzle piece couldn't have been cut out after the explosion and before the SWAT team arrived, which leaves two possibilities. One is that it was already cut out before Troy woke up, which, given that the trap was designed to kill him, that kind of makes sense that whoever did it went ahead and took the puzzle piece in advance. And it is hard for me to tell which part of the body exactly that puzzle piece is on, but I think it's possible it could be from somewhere that we never get a clear look at in his trap sequence. But if it wasn't taken before Troy woke up, then that leaves just one other possibility, which is kind of funny to think about. And that is that Detective Hoffman cut it out while investigating the scene. Now, that probably sounds a little ridiculous because it would require him to have been alone investigating the scene for long enough to do that, which, yeah, might not be realistic. But it is funny to speculate that maybe this was another way that the filmmakers were hinting at Hoffman being involved. Anyways, Carrie makes the observation that Troy was never going to survive the game. It was designed for his execution. And then Hoffman kind of reacts to that.
So far, this doesn't follow any of its patterns.
Meaning?
Well, how'd you get in here?
You cut the door down.
Why?
Because somebody heard an explosion. He called us.
I mean, why did you have to cut the door down?
It was welded shut. Bloody truck couldn't get in here.
Exactly.
I don't follow.
If the aim of Jigsaw's game was to get out before the bomb went off, then why was the door welded shut? The guy couldn't get out if he wanted to.
And then the next thing we know, Carrie is being attacked and put in a trap that is also designed for her execution. And in that scene, there's actually already a big hint that it wasn't Amanda alone that put her in this trap. When Carrie is first waking up, we see the key drop down into the acid, and then immediately after the key drops in, we hear a door close. And the only door that we see around Carrie is the one that in Saw 4, Rig busts through behind her. So what seems to have happened was that somebody tossed the key into the acid and then went out that door, closed it, and then left. And the fact that Amanda shows up in front of Carrie near the end of the game tells us this was not Amanda. In fact, we can similarly deduce that it wasn't Amanda that abducted Jeff and his daughter. If it had been her, she almost certainly would have seen family photos that would have revealed to her that Jeff and Lynn were husband and wife, which we obviously know she was not aware of. Combine that with the sheer number of abductions that had to be carried out around the same time. You know, you have Lynn, Jeff and his daughter, the 3 people in each of Jeff's traps. So that's 6 people right there. This definitely suggests Amanda didn't do all of that on her own. And we know that John, probably wasn't any help in that department. Which, tells us that there's someone else besides Amanda that's setting these things up for John. Yet another way that Saw 3 acts as the catalyst of the ongoing narrative of the Saw series is its introduction of the theme of revenge versus forgiveness and of the religious allegory in general, which I will be getting into a lot in the last half of this series. But revenge versus forgiveness is a huge part of what the conflict at the root of this series is all about. John is all about forgiveness, and he is adamant that the things that he does is all about rehabilitation. Meanwhile, as the series goes on and we get to know Hoffman, we come to realize that he's very much about revenge, and the things that he does is more about punishment. And so yet another way that Saw 3 becomes even more interesting as the series progresses is how Jeff represents that conflict between John and Hoffman. In many ways, Jeff represents both of these men. Like John, Jeff has lost his son. And like Hoffman, Jeff desperately wants revenge for the loss of his loved one. So the whole resolution to this film, and John's fate specifically, rests on the outcome of this sort of philosophical battle over Jeff's soul. And when we eventually find out that Hoffman meddled to kind of ensure that both Amanda and John ended up dead, it again makes this whole film much more impactful in the grand scheme of things. Speaking of Hoffman's interference, I know there's often some debate on how much John knew about Hoffman's letter and what it said. And that's largely because obviously the content of the letter implies that John doesn't know what the letter is referring to. And yet in this movie, it's John that tells Amanda about the envelope with her name on it. And I'm going to save my full thoughts on this for later on. But for now, I will say that if you look carefully, when Amanda is pouring out the contents of the envelope, there are actually several contents of that envelope. Therefore, it stands to reason that John left the envelope for Amanda with, whatever he had to say to her. And then Hoffman, knowing about the envelope, wrote the letter and put it into the envelope. And that's a good transition point for our final section. So when considering what I wanted from the conclusion to this series, one of the things that comes to mind from this film is the question of whether or not John knew about the letter. I also feel additional clarification on Amanda's actions, specifically regarding Troy and Detective Carey. Like, how much of that was Hoffman? How much of that was her? How much of what Hoffman was doing and was up to contributed to the emotions that Amanda was going through? And was her shooting Lynn the first time that Hoffman had manipulated her into doing something? Or was that just the most recent example? Alright, I can't really think of anything else that I wanted to say in this video specifically. I hope to see you guys in the next video. But until then,
Game over. Hello there. If you'd like to be notified when more videos like this one arrive, just click the circle to subscribe. In the meantime, you can click either of the two boxes to check out other content from this channel. Or don't. The choice is yours.